In this, the second part of our lecture, number 4 for day 4. We're going to focus in this second part on Frederick Douglass and Frederick Douglass's slave narrative. We're doing the first one, his memoir, his autobiography of the life of a slave. And I think it would be important for us to first think about who this Frederick Douglass was. A couple of things that are useful to frame it is that Frederick Douglass, one of the interesting statements, like one of the quotes that I think is worth offering as we think about Frederick Douglass, is something he wrote when he said, genealogical trees do not flourish among slaves. It's a very powerful statement. In my earlier lecture talking about African Americans and the enslavement of black people in America, African people in America, one of the things I spent some time thinking about was the way in which slavery itself was systematic about destroying any sense of and genealogy, any sense of ancestral connection for the African Americans, and therefore by doing so, what slavery itself did functionally, what slavery itself did was it did not value legacy, lineage, or any kind of genealogical thing, but actually set out to destroy it. Because this was inevitable once the individuals who we are talking about, who are living under the enslavement system, were property. And I think Frederick Douglass's story epitomizes the nature of that horror and that terrible affront on humanity. I think it's worth sort of really understanding that the extent of the abuse on the African who was being transported by force into this new world as an enslaved person is demonstrated by the fact that the societies from which these Africans came were built almost entirely and in truly remarkable ways on the belief in ancestors, the belief in the existence of ancestors as living entities who remain part of the lived experience. In the cosmology of many West African cultures and societies to this day, the ancestor, that is the living, those who had died before and those who are to come, all three existed in a functional and an effective way as powers that existed in society. And in many of these societies, the genealogical line was part of their own humanity, was part of their own protection, it was part of their own sense of belonging and place, frankly, part of their humanity. So when you force people out of that system and then you place them in a world in which they have no access to an understanding of their ancestors and the ancestral line, when you create a divide between that belief system, that structural belief system, and their understanding of themselves, what you're doing is imposing something violently, desperately horrendous on their humanity and their sense of self. In Western culture, while ancestry and genealogy were hugely important, to a large extent, they had value in terms of the legacy of inheritance, the legacy of what is owned, and so on. But they understood the value of genealogy. We know this about Western society and European society, and yet they set out to undermine that very value, that very critical factor of their humanity, the humanity of these African people, by denying it to them. And how do they deny it to them? They say, look, property is such that it can be moved at any point for economic reasons. In the case of Frederick Douglass, and I think Frederick Douglass exemplifies that situation, Frederick Douglass was born 1816 or 1817. The record that was found from his owner had him born in 1817. Frederick Douglass himself thought he was born in 1816, a year earlier. But he was actually born in 1817, and there are records to say that. Frederick Douglass was born to an enslaved woman who was his mother, right? And this enslaved woman gave birth to Frederick Douglass, and almost immediately after Frederick Douglass was born, the boy was taken from his mother and sold to another plantation where he was going to work on that plantation. And the mother was moved to another plantation where she was going to work. In other words, Frederick Douglass, built into his autobiography, is this awareness that from the very beginning, he had no relationship with his mother. His mother was taken away from him, and his mother was taken away from him for economic reasons. And even though he would occasionally see his mother or hear about his mother from somewhere else, that idea that she had many children, but as Frederick Douglass points out, she had many children, but she had no family. And this is a profound and complexly difficult thing for us to understand its implications. That this was a woman whose value was rested in her ability to produce African children, black children, not to produce them for her own sense of value, for her own sense of family, or for her own sustenance, but to produce them to feed into the engine of slave society, of slave economy, the slave economy. So Frederick Douglass himself represented somebody who did not know who his mother was very well. He had a vague recollection of her, and his mother died when he was about 6 or 7 years old, so he heard. And he still did not know who his father was. Some said his father was his master, the person who owned him. Some have said otherwise. And Douglass spent his whole life with incredible resources to do so, trying to identify who his father was. But what was absolutely unquestionable was that his father was a white man. And his father was a white man who had slept with his mother, raped his mother, most likely because of the power dynamic. And they had produced Frederick Douglass, who then became an enslaved man. So Frederick Douglass was enslaved and worked on the slave plantations, and had different jobs on the slave plantations. Eventually, he moved from different owners, some who taught him skills in trade and so on and so forth, and some who taught him skills in reading and writing. Douglass, in his own account, says he never was comfortable as a slave and was never satisfied with slavery and always felt the need to escape from slavery. And this was one of his greater wishes in life. But he gives a brilliant account, a clear account of being an enslaved person. He gives an account of seeing the abuse of the enslaved person. He gives an account of the fear that surrounded the enslaved person. For 20 years, Frederick Douglass was functioning as a slave. And for another 8 years of his life, until he was 28 years old, when he was able to buy his freedom by the sales of his books and by the assistance of abolitionists. Until that time, he was a man haunted by the law, because by him escaping from slavery, Frederick Douglass was breaking. Excuse me. Frederick Douglass was in fact breaking the law. He was an outlaw. And he was an outlaw who the law of the United States of America had made it such that if he was captured by slave catchers, people who went around capturing slaves who had escaped, he could be taken back into slavery immediately. And if he was killed in the process, then there was no punishment for the person who killed him in the process, because he had no rights. So for those 8 years of his life, Frederick Douglass was a man who was wanted. Now, very interestingly, it is during those 8 years of his life that Frederick Douglass would slowly grow into national prominence as the writer of the autobiography of Frederick Douglass, first of all, and also as the great orator. Frederick Douglass became somebody who would give lectures, give talks, and so on and so forth. And he was always escaping the slave catchers. He was always escaping the bounty hunters that were looking to find him. So it's a very interesting phenomenon that Frederick Douglass emerges as somebody who lived through slavery and wrote about slavery and came about this process of becoming this writer of this work. How did Frederick Douglass become this great orator? One of the things that would happen was that once Frederick Douglass became free, he was given opportunities to speak about his experience as a slave. He had moved away from the South and therefore was able to have a certain level of freedom. And he joined up with abolitionists. And these abolitionists worked hard to try and get him to tell the story of his experience as an enslaved individual. Um, and one of the key people in this process was a man called William Lloyd Garrison. And William Lloyd Garrison was, by any standard, a radical anti-slavery advocate, and not only an anti-slavery advocate, but somebody who felt that even if it took violence, there needed to be an action against a country that decided to enslave its own people. Garrison was a white man, and Garrison was a man of standing and of great influence and power. And he was amongst a group of people who were so much against slavery that they found it necessary to think about ways to end slavery by any means necessary. And in some instance, he came across this Frederick Douglass, who was giving some talk somewhere, and he thought, this is a guy that we should be using, because all the people who were giving evidence of how bad slavery were either not as eloquent as Frederick Douglass, they could not write, and so on, but also they were not enslaved people. They did not have the actual experience of being enslaved people. And Frederick Douglass, by all historical records, and of course we have all the photographs of Frederick Douglass, that he was a striking man. He was a striking looking man. He had the big hair. He had these features. He was called a lion, and so on and so forth. And he was incredibly charismatic. This is what the evidence of the time was. So Frederick Douglass was co-opted, was brought into the fold by William Lloyd Garrison, and encouraged and put on this platform to speak out against slavery. And Frederick Douglass proceeded to do so. And he proceeded to do so in his own terms and by his own ways that he would want to. Let's just understand that every speech that Frederick Douglass would make, beginning from that period, would represent the oeuvre, the body of work of the greatest orator of the 19th century that America had ever seen. He was the voice, and there's absolutely no debate about it. So these are the facts about Frederick Douglass that I think are worth understanding, and I don't think when we look at it from a historical point of view, it seems hard to understand. But Frederick Douglass was the most photographed American during his time, during the 19th century. Most photographed. Frederick Douglass would have been an Instagram guy. And those pictures were proliferated. He was the most photographed. He was the most traveled American, probably only second only to Mark Twain, who traveled the world. And of course, Frederick Douglass traveled around the world and so on. And then Frederick Douglass was the best known orator and speaker. And it is estimated that no other person was heard by Americans, by the number of Americans, by the same number of Americans as Frederick Douglass was. He toured the entire United States of America. He toured around the world because, of course, in those days, there was no recording, there was no television. So it was who got around and who got to speak. And Frederick Douglass, during the period of slavery leading up to the Civil War, and then after the period of slavery, through Reconstruction, and even on to the rest of his life, when Frederick Douglass became part of the government, he became an ambassador, he became a number of things. His oratory and his capacity to speak, especially as a suffragette, somebody fighting for the rights of women to vote and so on, which he was completely committed to. All through that time, Frederick Douglass was the voice in America, and the highly regarded and highly respected voice in America. And so Frederick Douglass has constructed, if we look at his whole body of work, constructed a fundamental argument about slavery and about America that I think remains one of the most lucid and clear articulations, one against slavery, and one that is the greatest and damning indictments of American society, and by extension American Christianity, in endorsing and supporting slavery. At the end of the day, Frederick Douglass declared, of course, that what was happening in America was in the perpetuation of slavery, was the articulation of the most profound level of hypocrisy, the articulation of the most anti-Christian expression, even though these people claim themselves to be Christian. Frederick Douglass would be bold and daring in saying these things. There were threats on his life. When his book first appeared, he had to flee to England and Ireland, where he was in hiding for a while. When he got back to America, he continued to speak and so on. But by then, he was now a free man, and therefore he would not be subject to the capture by bounty hunters and by slave catchers. But his life was not an easy life. And finally, I would say that one of the interesting moments in the film Birth of a Nation, which is one that you'll be looking at and be discussing, is there's a portrayal of somebody like Frederick Douglass in Birth of a Nation. Because for the racist, Ku Klux Klan supporting, slave holding people, Frederick Douglass was the boogeyman. Frederick Douglass was the greatest threat to racist society, and in that film, he's characterized in that way, which is worth paying attention to.